Almost always, somewhere over the Pacific, a river is flowing through the sky, not a metaphor, a measured, mapped feature of the atmosphere, a ribbon of water vapor hundreds of miles wide and thousands of miles long, moving toward a coastline. Meteorologists call them atmospheric rivers. A strong one carries many times the flow of the Mississippi through the air. Most of them arrive over California as ordinary winter storms. They fill the reservoirs. They build the snowpack. The state depends on them for its water and calls the biggest ones by an almost friendly name, the Pineapple Express. But the record, written in mud, in tree rings, in drowned telegraph poles, says the sky over California sometimes does something else, every 100 to 200 years, on a rhythm that has held for 2,000 years. The rivers in the sky stop taking turns. They line up, and they do not stop coming. The last time was the winter of 1861. It rained, with barely a pause, for 43 days. California's Central Valley, 300 miles long, became an inland sea. The state capital drowned. The new governor reached his own inauguration by rowboat, and the United States Geological Survey has already built the scenario for the modern repeat. Its price tag starts at $725 billion, and the scientists who reran the storm through the modern atmosphere found something worse than the number. This is the story of California's other big one. Understand the machine first, because the machine is the whole story. California's water arrives by airmail. Roughly a third to half of the state's annual precipitation is delivered by a handful of atmospheric river storms each winter, a few days' work by a few rivers of vapor. It is one of the most efficient water delivery systems on Earth, and one of the most binary. Too few rivers in a season is a drought. The state has built its entire plumbing, the reservoirs, the aqueducts, the levees, the snowpack as savings account, around catching them. Now run the machine one setting too high, the same ribbon of vapor but warmer, wetter, and, critically, not alone. A sequence. One river makes landfall, saturates the ground, fills the rivers to their brims, and before anything drains, the next one arrives, then the next. The reservoirs, built to catch water, must start releasing it onto land that can absorb nothing. The snowpack, built up by the early storms, is melted off the mountains by the warm, later ones. The savings account liquidated into the flood. Every feature that makes the machine a water supply becomes, past a threshold, an amplifier. Hold on to that double identity, because it is the whole strangeness of this file. Every other threat this channel covers is an enemy, a fault, a volcano, a storm surge. This one is the water supply. The same rivers of vapor the megaflood is made of are the ones the state prays for in drought years, and gets, and celebrates. There is no version of California without them. The hazard is not an intruder. It is the essential system, one setting too high. Which means the state cannot wall it out, or wish it away, or monitor it into submission. It can only build for the day the supply becomes the flood, and read the record of how often that day comes. So, the questions stack up. What actually happened in the winter the machine ran wild? And why does almost nobody know that the deadliest, most expensive disaster in 19th century California was not an earthquake? How do scientists know it was not a freak, that the sky has done this to this valley again and again, on schedule? Why did the federal government build a minute-by-minute scenario for the repeat and deliberately make it smaller than the real one? And what did the two scientists who reran the storm through the 21st century atmosphere find waiting in the odds? By the end of this video, 3 things will be clear. What 43 days of rain did to a functioning American state, down to the rowboat at the inauguration, and the 18 months of unpaid salaries. What the mud beneath California's bays remembers that its cities never learned, including floods that made 1862 look moderate. And one finding from a study published in the journal Science Advances about what has already quietly happened to the likelihood of the next one, while everyone watched the earthquake faults. That number is what this video closes on. It begins as an answer to prayers. California has been dry for years, and in November of 1861, the rain finally comes. First as heavy snow in the Sierra Nevada, burying the mountains that wall the Central Valley. Then the storms turn warm, and they stop taking turns. Through December, the rivers of the sky make landfall one after another, with barely a day between them. The valley's rivers, the Sacramento, the American, the Feather, the Yuba, leave their banks and do not return. Rain falls on the deep new snowpack and unlocks it, sending the mountain savings downhill in midwinter. By January, the storm track has been aimed at California nearly continuously for 43 days. Understand the trap the geography sets, because 1862 sprang it perfectly. The Central Valley is a bathtub 400 miles long, with one drain, the narrow gap at San Francisco Bay through which every river in the middle of the state must exit. In an ordinary winter, the drain keeps up. In that winter, the mountains on both sides poured their entire catchment into the tub faster than the gap could pass it to the sea, and the water simply had nowhere to be except everywhere. The valley did not flood the way a river floods, spilling and receding. It filled, and stayed filled for months, because the drain was the drain. On the 10th of January, 1862, Inauguration Day, the levees protecting Sacramento fail. The capital city drowns in hours. The ceremony goes ahead anyway, in a state house surrounded by water rising a foot an hour, and the newly elected governor, Leland Stanford, is rowed from his mansion to his own inauguration. When he is rowed home again, the water has risen so far that he enters his house through a second-story window. 12 days later, the state government gives up on its own capital. The legislature relocates to San Francisco and stays for 6 months while Sacramento drains. The state Supreme Court moves too and never comes back. And out in the valley, the scale of the thing becomes something no American had ever seen. An inland sea, 300 miles long and up to 60 across, standing where the middle of California used to be. Water 30 feet deep in places, deep enough to submerge the poles of the brand new transcontinental telegraph, completed mere months before. For roughly a month, the fastest growing state in the Union is functionally severed from itself. Roads gone, mail stopped, wires dead. A Yale geologist named William Brewer was traveling the state that winter, and his letters home are the flood's great eyewitness record. Steamboats running the valley, he and others report, stopped to lift people from treetops and rooftops. The water beneath them carried houses, haystacks, furniture, and the drowned livestock of an entire economy toward the sea. His letter of January 31st. Thousands of farms entirely underwater, cattle starving and drowning. The accounting, when it could finally be done. Roughly 1/4 of California's taxable property destroyed. 200,000 of the state's 800,000 cattle gone. The state government, its tax base underwater, could not pay its governor, its legislators or its employees for a year and a half. The recorded death toll says at least 21. The historians who reconstructed the flood believe the true number ran into the thousands. Mining camps on the swollen rivers, an entire settlement of Chinese miners drowned on the Yuba, most of them never counted by anyone. And the flood was not a Northern California story. The same storm train wrecked the South. Small towns along the rivers of the Los Angeles basin and beyond were destroyed outright, and the southern half of the state spent weeks cut off from its own government. No road, no wire, no word. Los Angeles, at the time, held fewer than 15,000 people and mostly grazed cattle. The same rivers, the same basin geography, the same storm track sit under 14 million people and a $1 trillion economy now. Every part of the state that flooded in 1862 has been, since, comprehensively built upon. California rebuilt and remembered for a while in concrete terms. Sacramento spent years raising its entire downtown 10 to 15 feet, jacking up buildings and burying its old first floors, a city standing on stilts of its own history. The ranching economy the flood destroyed was replaced by the farms that made the valley America's produce aisle. And then, with the efficiency this channel keeps documenting, the memory drained away faster than the water. The state that rebuilt itself on top of a flood line forgot where the line was. The rebuilt Sacramento carries the proof in its architecture to this day. Walk the old downtown, and you are walking on the second story of 1862. Beneath the sidewalks run the buried ground floors of the drowned city, doorways that open onto earth, windows bricked against soil. And underground the tour guides show visitors as a curiosity. It is not a curiosity. It is the high water mark, institutionalized. A city that lifted itself one full story out of respect for what the sky had done, and then, generation by generation, came to remember the lifting as quaint history, rather than as the measurement it was, which is where the mud comes in, because the mud did not forget, and what it remembers is worse. If these files are your kind of thing, documented hazards, real records, every number sourced, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, what the bottom of San Francisco Bay knows. When a megaflood drowns a valley, the water eventually finds the sea, and on the way, it carries the land with it. Silt, sand, shredded vegetation. An entire watershed's worth of debris flushed through the rivers and settled onto the floors of the bays and coastal basins in a single distinctive layer. Flood layer. Quiet century. Thin ordinary mud. Flood layer. The bottoms of California's bays are a barcode of catastrophes. The reading itself is the same craft this channel keeps returning to in a new medium. A core comes up from the bay floor like a drinking straw pulled from a milkshake. A column of layered time, gray and brown and finely banded. The ordinary centuries read as monotony. Thin, even mud, a millimeter's patience at a stretch. Then a band that does not belong. Coarser, thicker, jammed with the ground-up debris of a watershed emptied in a season. No storm that merely floods a county leaves that signature. Only the ones that empty the state into the sea. Date the shells and plant matter around the band, and the flood gets its century back. Geologists, most prominently Lynn Ingram at Berkeley, working with the hydrologist Michael Dettinger, drilled those barcodes and read them. The result rewrote 1862's place in history. The flood that bankrupted California was not a freak. Layers like it, several of them thicker, meaning bigger floods, recur through the cores on intervals ranging from about 50 years to about 400, averaging 100 to 200. The rhythm holds for as far down as the cores go, about 2,000 years of the sky periodically refilling the valley. Read that average against the calendar. The last megaflood ended in 1862. The average gap is 100 to 200 years. It has been 164. California is not overdue in any scientific sense. The record's own spread runs past 4 centuries. But the state is, by the mud's arithmetic, living in the heart of the window. And unlike the earthquake clocks this channel has covered, this one has a second hand that humans are winding. A warmer atmosphere holds roughly 7% more water per degree of warming. The machine's fuel supply is growing. Now calibrate what modern California thinks a bad storm is. The reference events, the winters people remember, are single atmospheric rivers or short trains of them. The storm parades that flood a few towns, close a few highways, make a season's news. The 2017 crisis at Oroville Dam, the tallest dam in America, its spillways failing under one wet winter's releases, roughly 180,000 people evacuated in an afternoon, is the closest living memory has come. Oroville was a single dam, strained by a strong but ordinary winter, and it nearly became the disaster. The megaflood in the cores is not that. It is that winter storms again and again for a month and a half, statewide. The reference memory and the recorded hazard are, once again, not the same kind of event. There is one more layer to the calibration problem, and it is generational. A Californian born the year of Oroville will be middle-aged before the mud's average interval since 1862 fully elapses, and every year of quiet in between will feel, to everyone living through it, like evidence. This is the same calibration error this channel found on the faults, with one difference that makes it worse here. Earthquakes at least have a famous reputation. The megaflood does not. The state's deadliest natural disaster class has no movie, no drill day, no place in the school books proportionate to its record. Ask a Californian to name the big one, and they will point at the ground. The record points at the sky. Every parameter of the machine has been measured. The vapor transport of the rivers in the sky, the 2,000-year rhythm in the mud, the 7% per degree physics of the warming air. The one thing the record cannot say is which winter the rivers stop taking turns. That blank is where the state's entire water and levee system, and the 40 million people behind it, currently live. In 2010, the USGS's Multi-Hazards Demonstration Project, the same program family that gave California its shakeout earthquake drill, decided the megaflood deserved what the faults had, a full scenario. They named it Arc Storm, AR for atmospheric river, K for 1,000, as in the neighborhood of a 1,000-year event. And then they made a choice that tells you everything about how seriously they expected to be doubted. They built the storm smaller than 1862. 23 days of storm instead of 43, stitched hour by hour from 2 storms that actually happened, January 1969 in the south and February 1986 in the north, run back to back. Nothing hypothetical about the weather. Only the sequence. A scenario no one could dismiss as fantasy, because every piece of it had already occurred inside living memory. Even pulled, the punch is staggering. The models flood lowlands across both ends of the state, up to 10 and 20 feet of standing water in places, for weeks. More than 50 levees fail. Over 1.5 million people require evacuation. 10 Orovilles at once, on flooded roads. 1/4 of California's buildings are touched by the water. Hurricane-force winds ride the storms in. Landslides close the mountain roots exactly when the valley roots are underwater, and the state's peculiar geography of risk asserts itself. The delta east of San Francisco, the fragile junction of levees through which drinking water for most of Southern California passes, sits in the flood's center of mass. The price? $725 billion in the report's own accounting, with later estimates running toward $1 trillion. Several times Shakeout's earthquake, delivered in slow motion, statewide. Linger on the Delta, because it is where the flood becomes a national story. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is 1,000 miles of aging levees protecting islands of farmland that have subsided, in places well below the water around them. A below-sea-level landscape held in shape by earthworks at the exact point where the state's flood arrives and the state's drinking water departs. Break enough of those levees at once, and the damage is not measured in flooded acres. Salt water pulls inland from the bay, into the intakes that feed the aqueducts, and the water supply for a majority of Californians is compromised not for the storm's weeks, but potentially for years of repairs. The scenario's slow motion hides its reach. The earthquake breaks a region. The storm reaches into every tap in the southern half of the state. The report's language on casualties is the restrained federal kind. It projects, in its own words, substantial loss of life, and its authors understood that the deaths would concentrate wherever evacuation fails. In the reach of levee breaks that give no warning, on road networks designed for commuting rather than exodus, and downstream of any dam that loses its argument with the inflow. One of those dams, a structure east of Los Angeles that the Army Corps of Engineers rates among the most dangerous in America, precisely because of a storm like this, has a file of its own on this channel coming. The storm and the dam are one story, told twice. Play the Exodus arithmetic forward, because the report's planners did. 1.5 million evacuees is not a number. It is a road problem. It is the Central Valley's towns and the river-adjacent suburbs moving at once, on highways that flood at their low points first, toward higher ground that has no beds for them, over a span of days in which the storm does not pause to let the traffic clear. Oroville moved 180,000 people in an afternoon, with dry roads, and produced gridlock measured in hours. The scenario asks for 10 times the people in the rain for weeks in multiple regions simultaneously. This is why the forecast matters more than any levee. The only version of this evacuation that works is the one that starts before the water arrives, and ArcStorm's deepest finding was not a number at all. It was the shape of the problem. Unlike an earthquake, this disaster arrives with a weather forecast, days of warning, maybe a week, and then tests something no fault ever tests. Whether institutions can act on a forecast of something none of their staff have ever seen. The scenario's planners built exercises around it. The state's emergency office now plans for megastorms explicitly. The forecast is the mercy of this disaster. Whether it is used is the variable, and this channel has already shown you in a valley in Colombia exactly what an unused warning costs. If this channel earns its place in your feed, a subscription this early matters. 1 page left. The study that took ArcStorm's storm and asked the only question the 2010 report could not: what has the warming sky already done to the odds? In 2022, 2 scientists, Xingying Huang and Daniel Swain, rebuilt the megaflood for the modern sky. Not stitched from historical storms, but generated inside climate models, 30-day storm sequences, simulated at fine resolution, for the atmosphere as it is and as it is becoming. They published in Science Advances under a name that said exactly what it was: Arc Storm 2.0. The finding this video promised you is the study's central one. Climate change has already roughly doubled the likelihood of the megaflood scenario. Not will double, has. The warming that has occurred to date, the 7% per degree loading of the machine, has done its work on the odds while the state's disaster imagination stayed parked on its faults. And the study's forward look is worse. In its end-of-century simulations, the storms run wetter still, with mountain runoff multiplied to several times its historical scale, as more of the Sierra's precipitation falls as warm rain on snow. Daniel Swain has since put the near-term odds in a sentence anyone can carry. Roughly a coin flip that California sees another Arc Storm-class event by 2060. Set the three records side by side, because together they are the whole file. The mud, 100 to 200-year rhythm, 2,000 years deep, last struck in 1862. The scenario, the modern repeat, deliberately understated, priced at $750 billion and 1.5 million evacuations. The study, the odds, already doubled, still climbing. California's water arrives by rivers in the sky, and the sky is carrying more water than it carried for any flood in the cores. And notice what kind of protection the intervening century and a half actually bought. The levee system is vastly larger than 1862's, and vastly more consequential when it fails, because the land behind it filled with people, precisely because the levees made it feel safe. The reservoirs that did not exist in 1862 can absorb the front end of a storm sequence and become forced contributors to the back end of one, releasing into the flood because the alternative is Oroville's afternoon everywhere. Engineering moved the threshold. It did not repeal the rhythm. The mud's barcode does not have a final entry marked solved. So the honest questions are the open ones. Which arrives first, the storm sequence or the levee and reservoir upgrades designed for it? When the forecast comes, a week out, showing the rivers lining up, does a state that has never evacuated 1 million people believe it in time? And how many of the 40 million living on the floor of a sea that has filled on schedule for 2 millennia know that the schedule exists? The valley has drowned by the mud's count again and again for 2,000 years. In 1862, it happened to a state of 400,000, and the capital moved by rowboat. 1862 was the rehearsal, with 400,000 people. The performance has 40 million, and the odds have already doubled.